It was a crisp autumn morning in Cedar Hill, the kind of quiet town where nothing much ever seemed to change. The streets were lined with golden leaves, the air was cool, and the sun barely peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows over the narrow roads. In a small, unassuming house near the edge of town, Ben Carter stirred from his sleep. His alarm clock buzzed, breaking the peaceful silence. He sat up in bed, running his fingers through his thinning hair, his mind already preparing for another routine day. Ben was a music teacher at Cedar Hill High School, where he'd been working for nearly 2 decades. He loved music, always had. In his youth, he dreamt of becoming a professional musician, of touring the world and playing to sold-out crowds. But life had other plans. After years of trying and failing to break into the industry, Ben found himself settling down in his hometown, taking up a teaching job to provide for his family. Now, at 46, those dreams were far behind him, buried under the responsibilities of adulthood. Still, he took solace in the fact that he could at least share his love for music with the next generation, even if his own chance at stardom had long since passed. After a quick breakfast with his wife, Sarah, and a brief goodbye to their teenage daughter, Emily, Ben grabbed his guitar case and headed out the door. The drive to the high school was short, just a few blocks, and as he pulled into the parking lot, he felt the familiar weight of routine settle on his shoulders. His days had a rhythm of their own, predictable and steady, much like the music he used to play. But something about this day felt different, though he couldn't quite place it. The school was buzzing with excitement over the upcoming Cedar Hill Fall Festival, an annual event that brought the whole town together for a weekend of food, games, and local performances. Ben had been involved in organizing the festival for years, though he'd never been one of the performers. His role was strictly behind the scenes now, helping his students prepare for their parts in the festival's talent showcase. He had grown comfortable being in the background, watching others take the stage while he guided them from the sidelines. But as Ben walked down the familiar hallway toward the music room, he was met by Lisa Reynolds, the festival's coordinator, rushing toward him with a look of panic in her eyes. "Ben," she called out, breathless, "we've got a problem. A huge problem." Ben stopped in his tracks, concerned. "What's going on?" Lisa sighed, her face flushed with stress. "Our headliner just dropped out. They called me this morning. He's sick and can't make it." Ben raised an eyebrow. "The headliner for the festival? That's in 2 days. Can't we find someone else?" Lisa shook her head. "I've been calling around all morning. No one's available on such short notice. And the town's expecting a big performance. We can't just leave the main slot empty." Ben frowned. He knew how important the festival was to the community, and Lisa had put in countless hours to make it special. Still, he wasn't sure what he could do about it. "Well, what do you need me to do? I can help find someone." Lisa cut him off, her eyes locking onto his. "Ben, we want you to do it." Ben blinked, completely caught off guard. "Me? Lisa, no, I haven't performed in front of an audience in years. I'm just the music teacher." Lisa smiled, though there was a hint of desperation behind it. "Exactly. You're the music teacher everyone loves. You know how much this town respects you, how much your students look up to you. You're perfect for it. Plus, you're incredibly talented. I've heard you play at those small recitals you do with the kids. You've still got it, Ben." But Ben wasn't convinced. He hadn't stepped onto a stage since his younger days, when his dream of becoming a professional musician was still alive. The idea of performing in front of the whole town made his stomach turn. He opened his mouth to protest, but Lisa beat him to it. "Please, Ben, we need you. I don't have anyone else. Just think about it, okay?" She gave him a hopeful look before walking away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the hallway, his mind racing. Could he really do it? Could he step back onto a stage after all these years? The thought filled him with dread. But there was something else, too, a faint flicker of excitement, a reminder of the thrill he used to feel when he played music for others. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ben went through the motions of teaching his classes, but his mind was elsewhere, torn between the weight of responsibility and the possibility of reigniting the dream he'd buried so long ago. By the time he returned home that evening, he still hadn't made a decision. Over dinner, Sarah noticed his distraction. "You've been quiet today," she remarked. "Everything okay at school?" Ben hesitated, then told her about Lisa's request. Sarah smiled knowingly. "I think you should do it. You've always been happiest when you're playing music, Ben, and you'd be great." Ben sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know. It's been so long since I performed. What if I mess up? What if I make a fool of myself in front of the whole town?" Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "You won't mess up. And even if you did, people would still love and respect you. But I think you'll surprise yourself. This could be your chance to do something just for you." Ben looked at her, his heart heavy with indecision. Sarah had always been his biggest supporter, even when he doubted himself. He wanted to believe her, but the fear of failure still loomed large in his mind. That night, after Sarah and Emily had gone to bed, Ben found himself alone in the living room, staring at his old guitar case in the corner. It had been a long time since he'd even opened it. Slowly, he got up and crossed the room, kneeling down in front of the case. His hands trembled as he unlatched it and lifted the lid, revealing the worn, familiar wood of his guitar. He ran his fingers over the strings, feeling the slight resistance beneath his fingertips. Before he knew it, he was sitting on the couch, the guitar in his lap, strumming softly. The sound was rusty at first, but as he continued to play, the notes began to flow more smoothly, filling the quiet house with music. For the first time in years, Ben felt that old spark, the one that had driven him to chase his dream in the first place. Maybe, just maybe, he still had something left to give. The next morning, Ben called Lisa and told her he'd do it. He would take the stage at the festival. But as the reality of the decision settled in, so did the nerves. The days leading up to the festival were a blur of preparation. Ben practiced every night after work, staying up late into the evening, trying to shake off the rust and rebuild his confidence. But no matter how much he practiced, the fear of failure gnawed at him. By the time the day of the festival arrived, Ben was a bundle of nerves. He stood backstage, watching the other performers with a growing sense of dread. His hands were sweaty, his heart racing. He hadn't felt this kind of anxiety in years. What if he forgot the lyrics? What if his fingers slipped on the strings? What if the crowd hated it? As the announcer called his name, Ben took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, the crowd a sea of faces, watching and waiting. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone and strummed the first chord. For a moment, he thought he might pass out, but then something incredible happened. As he began to play, the fear melted away. The music took over, and suddenly, it was as if no time had passed at all. The crowd was silent, hanging on every note, and by the time Ben finished the song, there was a moment of stunned silence before the applause erupted. People were on their feet, cheering, some with tears in their eyes, and for the first time in years, Ben felt alive. Little did he know, there was someone in the crowd who would change his life forever. In the days that followed Ben Carter's unexpected performance at the Cedar Hill Fall Festival, the quiet hum of small-town life seemed to be overtaken by an electric buzz. Whispers floated through the town, from the grocery store to the school hallways, and even the local diner was filled with chatter about Ben's performance. People who had known him for years, neighbors who'd passed him by every morning without a second glance, now looked at him with new eyes. There was something about that performance, something that left a mark on everyone who witnessed it. But for Ben, the performance wasn't just about the music. It was a door he thought had closed long ago, now creaking open ever so slightly. He'd felt it on stage, the rush of the crowd's energy, the freedom that came with pouring himself into the music. For a brief moment, he wasn't a music teacher or a man in his late 40s looking back on a life of missed opportunities. He was simply a musician, lost in the sound of his guitar and the lyrics that had carried him through so many silent nights. Yet the performance came with a flood of emotions, both exhilarating and overwhelming. The morning after the festival, Ben sat in his kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, staring blankly out the window as the events of the night before played over and over in his mind. Sarah bustled about the kitchen, cooking breakfast for Emily, who was running late for school as usual. "Mom, have you seen my bag?" Emily called from upstairs, her voice muffled. Sarah, with her usual calm, placed a plate of pancakes on the table. "It's in the living room, where you left it last night." Ben barely registered the conversation. His thoughts were still tangled up in what had happened. He could still hear the applause, the cheers. He hadn't felt that kind of appreciation, that validation in years. And now, as the reality of it all settled in, a question began gnawing at him. What was next? As if sensing his unease, Sarah set a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" she asked softly. Ben shook himself from his thoughts. "Yeah, just still thinking about last night, I guess." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "It was amazing, Ben. I've never seen the town react like that. You really were incredible." Her words should have made him feel better, but instead they only deepened his confusion. "Yeah, but what now? I mean, it was just one performance. What am I supposed to do with that?" Before Sarah could answer, the phone rang, breaking the moment. Ben reached for it absent-mindedly, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. "Hello. Is this Ben Carter?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but there was a certain sharpness to it, a confidence that made Ben sit up straighter. "Yes, this is Ben. This is Daniel Ross. I'm a producer with Westwood Records. I was at the festival last night, and I saw your performance." For a moment, Ben didn't process the words, "the producer." He wasn't sure if he'd heard right. His mind raced, trying to catch up with what was happening. "You were at the festival." Ben's voice came out more incredulous than he intended. Daniel chuckled lightly on the other end. "Yes, I was visiting family in the area, and they dragged me to the festival. I wasn't expecting to hear anything particularly noteworthy, but your performance—" He paused as if to let the weight of his words sink in. "It was exceptional, Ben. That kind of raw talent doesn't come along often." Ben's heart pounded in his chest. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Daniel Ross. Westwood Records. These weren't just names. They were symbols of the music world he had long since resigned himself to leaving behind. He hadn't even realized people like that would be anywhere near Cedar Hill, let alone watching his performance. I don't know what to say," Ben stammered, glancing over at Sarah, who had paused in the middle of flipping a pancake to stare at him in wide-eyed wonder. "You don't have to say much right now," Daniel continued. "I'm just calling to say I think you've got something special, Ben. I'd like to sit down and talk with you about a possible opportunity." Ben swallowed hard, his mind spinning. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, not to people like him. Not to a middle-aged music teacher from a small town who had given up on his dreams decades ago. It felt surreal, like he was floating just above his own body, watching the conversation unfold from a distance. I'd be interested," Ben managed to say, though his voice was shaky. "Good," Daniel said, his tone professional but warm. "I'll be in town for a few more days. How about we meet tomorrow? I'll send you the details." Ben nodded, though Daniel couldn't see him. "Yeah, sure. Tomorrow works." "Great. I'll be in touch." As the call ended, Ben slowly lowered the phone to the table, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah was staring at him, her eyes wide with excitement and disbelief. "Who was that?" she asked, though she must have had some idea from the snippets of the conversation she'd overheard. Ben looked at her, still trying to process what had just happened. "A music producer. He saw my performance last night. He wants to meet with me about something. I don't even know what. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air, too heavy to put into words. Ben's mind raced with possibilities, but for every hopeful thought, there was an equally powerful wave of doubt. Could he really do this? Was this a chance to reclaim the dream he once had? Or was it just a cruel joke, a fleeting moment of attention that would fade just as quickly as it had come? The next 24 hours were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Ben could barely focus on his classes at school, his mind constantly wandering to the upcoming meeting with Daniel Ross. He told no one at the school about it, not even his closest colleagues. Somehow, talking about it out loud made it seem even more impossible. Instead, he kept the news to himself, replaying the conversation over and over in his head, searching for any sign that it was all some kind of mistake. The following afternoon, Ben found himself in the parking lot of a small cafe on the outskirts of town, his hands slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel. He was supposed to meet Daniel Ross inside, but now that the moment was here, a part of him wanted to turn the car around and go home. This was too much. It was too real. He wasn't ready. But then, as if summoned by the force of his own thoughts, the image of his performance at the festival came back to him. The way the crowd had reacted, the way he had felt alive in a way he hadn't for years. That feeling had been real too, and if there was even the slightest chance of recapturing it, he had to at least try. With a deep breath, Ben stepped out of the car and walked toward the cafe. Inside, he spotted Daniel Ross immediately. A man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, polished appearance. He exuded confidence, the kind of effortless cool that came from years in the industry. "Ben," Daniel greeted him warmly, standing to shake his hand. "I'm glad you could make it." They sat down, and after a few minutes of small talk, Daniel got straight to the point. "I've been in this business a long time," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I know talent when I see it, and I saw something in you last night that I haven't seen in a while. Your performance. It wasn't just technically good. It had heart, and that's what people connect with." Ben listened, unsure of what to say. Compliments like these felt foreign, especially after so many years of feeling like he was just going through the motions in life. "I appreciate that," Ben said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I'm not sure what you're offering here." Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I'm offering you a chance to take that next step. I think you've got the potential to make a name for yourself in the music world. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But with the right guidance, I think you could go places." Ben felt his heart racing again. This was the moment. The kind of opportunity he'd dreamed about in his 20s, but had never thought would come. But now, as he sat across from a man who could potentially make it all happen, the weight of the decision hit him full force. Could he really take this step? Could he risk everything he had built for a shot at something he had given up on years ago? He wasn't just a young man with dreams anymore. He had responsibilities, a family, a job, a life that he couldn't just walk away from. "I don't know," Ben began, his voice trailing off. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like that." Daniel didn't push. He simply nodded, as if he understood the gravity of what Ben was feeling. "I get it. It's a big decision. I'm not asking for an answer right now. But think about it. The door is open, Ben. All you have to do is walk through it." Ben sat there for a long moment, staring at his cup of coffee as if it held the answer. The days following Ben's meeting with Daniel Ross were a whirlwind of uncertainty, anticipation, and doubt. It was as if his mind had been thrust into a tug-of-war between his past and his present, between the life he had built and the one he had always dreamed of. The possibility of a second chance at music was both thrilling and terrifying. And yet, despite all the doubt swirling in his mind, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. A chance to reclaim the dream he had buried years ago. But dreams, he knew, didn't come without consequences. Ben's nights were sleepless, filled with rehearsals in his head of how things might play out. He would lie awake next to Sarah, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, his mind racing through a million possibilities. Should he take the plunge and dive into the opportunity that Daniel had presented? Or was this just a fleeting moment, something that would disappear just as quickly as it had arrived? In the quiet hours before dawn, the weight of his decision seemed unbearable. One evening, Ben found himself in the garage, where he kept his old vinyl records and boxes of memorabilia from his early days as a musician. The smell of dust and cardboard filled the air as he rummaged through old flyers and concert programs, his fingers brushing over faded memories of gigs he had played in his 20s. The excitement, the hunger for success, it had been intoxicating back then, but it had also been exhausting, relentless, and unforgiving. Every rejection had chipped away at him until there was nothing left but the shell of a dream. Now, years later, it seemed that dream was knocking at his door again, only this time with higher stakes. His life wasn't just his own anymore. He had responsibilities. Sarah, Emily, his students, they all depended on him. How could he possibly chase after something so uncertain when everything in his current life was built on stability? It wasn't until the next morning, over breakfast with Sarah and Emily, that the weight of the situation came crashing down on him. Sarah, ever the perceptive one, noticed the tension in his eyes before he even said a word. "You've been awfully quiet these past few days," she said gently, setting down her coffee cup. "What's on your mind?" Ben looked at her, then at Emily, who was absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone between bites of toast. He hesitated, unsure of how to even begin explaining the storm that had taken root in his heart. But there was no more running from it. I met with that producer," he said, his voice quiet and tentative. "Daniel Ross. He's offering me something. An opportunity. He thinks I could make it, Sarah. He thinks I could actually do this." Sarah didn't say anything at first, her expression calm but unreadable. She had always been supportive of Ben's music, even during the years when he had lost faith in himself. But this was different. This wasn't just about him playing at a local festival or teaching his students to love music. This was about Ben stepping back into a world he had walked away from, a world that could either lift him up or tear him apart. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked after a long pause. That was the question that had been gnawing at him ever since Daniel Ross had first made his offer. What did he want? Could he even allow himself to want this again? "I don't know," Ben admitted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Part of me wants to take the chance. It's everything I used to dream about. But what if it's just a fantasy? I'm not young anymore, Sarah. I'm not the same guy who thought he could conquer the world with his guitar." Sarah studied him for a moment, her eyes softening with understanding. "You don't have to be the same guy," she said. "You've grown, then. You're wiser now. Maybe that's what you need to see. You're not chasing the same dream anymore. This could be something different." Emily, who had been quietly listening, finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed. "Dad, I don't know much about this whole music industry thing, but if you really want it, why wouldn't you at least try? I mean, what's the worst that could happen?" Ben smiled weakly at his daughter's simplicity. It was so easy for her to see the world in black and white, but for him, everything was gray. The worst that could happen, he thought, was that he would fall flat on his face and disappoint not only himself, but the people he cared about most. He had made sacrifices for his family over the years, letting go of his dream so that he could provide for them. Now, after all this time, was it fair to put them through the uncertainty of him chasing a dream that might not even work out? These thoughts plagued him every minute of every day. Later that week, Ben received another call from Daniel. The producer was patient, understanding that Ben needed time to think things over, but he couldn't wait forever. "I'll be leaving town in a few days," Daniel said. "But I'd like to know your answer before I go." The pressure of the decision pressed down harder than ever. Ben knew he had to decide. It wasn't just about whether he still had what it took. It was about whether he had the courage to leap into the unknown again. That evening, Ben found himself walking through the quiet streets of Cedar Hill, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin. The sun had already set, and the streetlights cast long, soft shadows over the empty sidewalks. The town had a way of grounding him, reminding him of the life he had built here, the people who had become part of his daily rhythm. He passed the high school, the grocery store, the old diner where he and Sarah had shared countless Sunday breakfasts. And then he reached the festival grounds, now empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the lively crowd that had filled the space just days before. He stood there for a long time, looking at the stage where he had performed, the echoes of applause still fresh in his memory. That one moment had reignited something in him, something he thought had died long ago. But as he stood there, staring at the empty stage, the weight of his decision became even clearer. This wasn't just about chasing a dream. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he had lost along the way. It was about taking a risk, even if that risk meant failure. When Ben returned home that night, he found Sarah waiting for him in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up as he walked in, her expression soft but curious. "I think I know what I have to do," Ben said, sitting down next to her. Sarah set her book aside and turned to face him fully. "And what's that?" "I have to at least try," he said, the words coming out slow but steady. "If I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. I don't want to live with that regret anymore." Sarah smiled gently, her eyes filling with pride. "I think you're right." But Ben continued, his voice growing more serious. "I don't want to put you or Emily through unnecessary hardship. I know this isn't going to be easy, and I don't want to drag you both into something that could go nowhere." Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together, Ben. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out. But I believe in you. I always have." Ben's chest swelled with emotion as he looked at her, the woman who had stood by his side through all the ups and downs of life. She was right. They were in this together, and no matter what happened, they would find a way through it. The next morning, Ben called Daniel Ross and told him he was in. The relief that washed over him after making the decision was immediate. For the first time in days, the storm in his mind seemed to calm, and in its place was a quiet resolve. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he was ready to face it, one note at a time. As he hung up the phone, a new sense of purpose filled him. This wasn't just about reclaiming a dream. It was about creating something new, something he hadn't even realized he was capable of. It was a second chance, not just at music, but at life. And for the first time in a long time, Ben felt alive again. The decision had been made. Ben Carter was stepping back into the world he had once left behind, but this time it felt different. He wasn't a young man fueled by blind ambition and naive hope. He was older now, wiser, and more cautious. The excitement he felt was tempered by the reality of what this decision would mean for his life, his family, and the town that had become his home. But beneath the caution, there was a fire, a spark that had reignited something deep within him. And now that it had been lit, there was no turning back. The day after his call with Daniel Ross, Ben found himself back in his living room, guitar in hand, staring down at the familiar strings. He had always kept his guitar close, a reminder of the life he once pursued. It had sat in the corner of the room, collecting dust, until that fateful night at the festival. But now, it was more than a relic of the past. It was his future. His fingers moved slowly at first, the muscle memory returning as he played a few soft chords. The sound was still there, the music that had always been a part of him, waiting to be unleashed again. His first meeting with Daniel had been scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, Ben had plenty of time to practice. He wasn't sure what to expect from the meeting, whether Daniel had grand plans for him or if this was just a tentative first step. But either way, Ben knew he needed to be ready. Days passed quickly, each one filled with a mixture of nervous anticipation and excitement. Ben threw himself into his music, practicing for hours every evening after work, while still trying to keep up with his day-to-day responsibilities at the school. His students had noticed a change in him. He seemed more alive, more energized, though they didn't know the reason behind it. Word of his performance at the festival had spread through the town, but Ben remained tight-lipped about the producer's interest, unsure of how things would play out. It wasn't until the following Friday that Ben found himself driving to a small studio on the outskirts of a neighboring town, where Daniel had arranged to meet. The drive was quiet, the autumn leaves falling around him like confetti, a gentle reminder of how fleeting moments could be. He tried to keep his mind focused on the road, but the nerves were creeping in, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. This was real now, no longer just a hypothetical conversation over the phone. His future was about to be shaped by whatever happened in that studio. When Ben arrived, he parked his car in the small lot outside the unassuming brick building. The studio itself wasn't flashy or modern. It had the look of a place that had seen years of creative energy pass through it, a place where dreams were forged in late-night sessions and early morning recordings. Ben's palms were slick with sweat as he grabbed his guitar case from the backseat and walked toward the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, Daniel was waiting, dressed casually but exuding the same cool confidence that had caught Ben off guard during their first meeting. He greeted Ben with a firm handshake and a smile, guiding him into the main recording room, where the real magic happened. "Glad you could make it, Ben," Daniel said as they sat down across from each other, separated by a glass panel that looked into the recording booth. "I know this is all happening fast, but that's how the industry works. Opportunities don't wait." Ben nodded, feeling the weight of that statement. He had spent so many years waiting for the right moment, and now, here it was, unfolding in front of him. There was no time for second-guessing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Ben admitted, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his guitar case. "About taking that leap. It's terrifying, honestly, but I'm ready to see where this can go." Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the spirit, and you've got more than just potential, Ben. I've seen a lot of people come through this industry, and I know what sells. But more than that, I know what connects with people. That performance at the festival, it wasn't just good, it was real. Authentic. That's what people crave." Ben wasn't sure if he believed it. It was one thing to play for his town, a community that had supported him for years, but the world outside of Cedar Hill, that was a different story. But Daniel's confidence was infectious, and despite his doubts, Ben felt a flicker of hope begin to grow. "So, what's the next step?" Ben asked, eager but cautious. "We'll start with a demo," Daniel said, gesturing toward the recording booth. "Get you in there, lay down a few tracks. See where your sound is at right now. Once we have something solid, we can start shopping it around. I've got connections with a few indie labels, and if things go well, we could even aim higher. The key is building momentum." Ben swallowed hard, the reality of it all hitting him. This was really happening. He was about to record a demo for the first time in over 20 years. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Daniel stood up and motioned for Ben to follow him into the booth. The room was small but cozy, filled with high-quality recording equipment and a set of headphones that Ben gingerly placed over his ears. He stood in front of the microphone, guitar in hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The red light above the door blinked on, signaling that the recording had begun. For a moment, Ben's mind went blank. He stared at the strings of his guitar, the familiar wood beneath his fingers, and the microphone in front of him. This was it, the moment he had dreamed about for so long, the moment he had thought would never come. And then he started to play. The music flowed from him effortlessly, as if no time had passed at all. The song he had written years ago, the one that had captivated the audience at the festival, poured out of him with a new kind of energy, a passion that had been dormant for so long but was now fully awake. His fingers danced over the strings, his voice steady and strong as he sang the lyrics that had come from the deepest parts of himself. The room seemed to disappear, and for those few minutes, it was just him and the music. He could feel the emotion building inside him, rising with each note until it finally broke free, filling the booth with a sound that was raw, unpolished, but undeniably real. When the song ended, Ben stood there for a moment, his breathing heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed felt deafening, but it was quickly broken by Daniel's voice crackling through the headphones. "That was incredible, Ben," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've still got it. More than that, you've got something special." Ben exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. He hadn't realized just how much he had needed to hear those words. They spent the next few hours recording, laying down track after track, with Daniel offering guidance and feedback along the way. The process was exhausting but exhilarating, and by the time they were finished, Ben felt more alive than he had in years. As they wrapped up, Daniel pulled Ben aside. "I'll get these tracks polished up and send them out to a few people I trust. But I want you to prepare yourself. This isn't going to be easy, Ben. There will be a lot of ups and downs. The industry can be brutal. But if you're willing to stick with it, I think we can really do something here." Ben nodded, his resolve solidifying. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The drive back home was quiet, the sky darkening as the sun set behind the trees. But inside, Ben felt lighter than he had in years. He had taken the first step, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he was ready to face whatever came next. When he walked through the front door, Sarah was waiting for him, her eyes filled with curiosity and hope. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The smile on Ben's face told her everything. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Ben felt the weight of the past slowly begin to lift. The doubt, the fear, the regret. It was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had taken control of his future, and no matter what happened next, he knew he had made the right choice. But what Ben didn't know was that this was only the beginning. There were forces at play that he couldn't yet see, twists and turns that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. In the weeks that followed Ben's first recording session, life became a whirlwind of activity. Every day, he found himself straddling two very different worlds. By day, he was still the dedicated music teacher, patiently guiding his students through the basics of scales, chords, and harmonies, while fielding questions about the fall festival performance. It seemed that the whole town was still buzzing with excitement, and his students, who had always known him as Mr. Carter the teacher, now saw him as something more, a figure of local legend, a symbol of hope for anyone with dreams bigger than the town itself. By night, though, Ben was living a very different reality. The music industry, as Daniel had warned him, was a complex and sometimes unforgiving place. Daniel had sent Ben's demo to a few trusted contacts, and while the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, nothing happened as quickly as Ben had expected. Days turned into weeks, and Ben found himself oscillating between excitement and crushing doubt. Was this all just a fleeting moment? Would the initial spark of interest fade before it ever had a chance to turn into something real? Daniel, ever the seasoned veteran of the industry, reassured Ben that this was normal, that things in the music world often moved at a glacial pace before suddenly accelerating at breakneck speed. Still, the waiting gnawed at Ben. Every time his phone rang, he jumped, hoping it would be Daniel with news of a breakthrough. But more often than not, it was just routine calls from the school or someone from the town checking in. The tension weighed heavily on him, pulling him in two directions, one part of him desperate to push forward, to take that next step, while the other part feared that nothing would come of it, and that he'd be left with nothing but an empty hope and a fading dream. It wasn't until early November that the first real glimmer of opportunity appeared. Ben had just finished a particularly long day at school and was driving home through the crisp autumn evening when his phone buzzed. He pulled over to check it, his heart racing as he saw Daniel's name flash on the screen. "Hey, Ben," Daniel said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of excitement. "I've got some good news." Ben's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What's going on?" "There's a small indie label in Nashville, Blue Sky Records. One of the producers there heard your demo, and they're interested in meeting with you. It's not a guaranteed deal, but they want to talk." They liked what they heard, Ben. Ben's heart raced. Nashville, the heart of country and Americana music. The city that had launched countless careers. "What do they want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the surge of excitement. "They want to meet with you in person, hear you play live. It's a big step, Ben. This could be the break we've been waiting for." The rest of the conversation passed in a blur, with Daniel explaining the details. The meeting was set for 2 weeks from now. Ben would fly out to Nashville, perform a live set for the producers at Blue Sky Records, and see where things went from there. The moment the call ended, Ben sat in his car for a long while, staring out at the quiet streets of Cedar Hill, his mind racing. This was it, the chance he had been waiting for. And yet, beneath the excitement, a familiar fear crept in. What if he wasn't good enough? What if this meeting was just another step toward disappointment? He drove home in a daze, his thoughts bouncing between the opportunity ahead and the life he had here in Cedar Hill. How would Sarah and Emily react to the news? They had been nothing but supportive so far, but Nashville felt like a different world. It was one thing to perform at a local festival or record a demo in a small studio. It was another to fly to Nashville and audition for a record label. When he walked through the front door, Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen, as she often was at the end of the day, preparing dinner with the easy grace of someone who had long since mastered the art of multitasking. Emily was upstairs, studying for a test, the normalcy of their home life a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside Ben. "Hey, how was work?" Sarah asked, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. Ben hesitated for a moment before answering. "I got a call from Daniel. He says there's a label in Nashville that wants to meet with me." Sarah stopped what she was doing and turned to face him fully, her expression a mixture of surprise and excitement. "A label? Like a real label?" Ben nodded, trying to downplay his own nerves. "Yeah, Blue Sky Records. It's not a big deal yet, just a meeting. But they like the demo, and they want to see what I can do live." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ben could see the wheels turning in Sarah's mind. The same mixture of excitement and concern that had been running through his own head since the call. Finally, Sarah smiled, though there was a hint of apprehension in her eyes. "This is amazing, Ben. I mean, Nashville. That's huge." Ben nodded, but the weight of it all pressed down on him. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Sarah. What if it's too much? What if I'm too old for this? I've spent so long just being a teacher, being a dad. I don't know if I can jump back into this world." Sarah crossed the kitchen, wrapping her arms around him in a gentle, reassuring hug. "You've already proven that you're more than just a teacher or a dad. That performance at the festival, the demo you recorded, it's all leading to this. You're ready, Ben. You wouldn't have come this far if you weren't." Ben held her close, drawing strength from her unwavering belief in him. But even as she spoke, the doubts lingered. How could he balance his responsibilities at home with this new possibility? Could he really chase this dream without sacrificing the life they had built together? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Ben spent every free moment practicing, refining his set, making sure every note was perfect. But with each passing day, the tension in him grew. The enormity of the opportunity ahead was daunting. It wasn't just a performance, it was a test, a chance to prove himself in front of people who could change his life forever. Finally, the day of the flight arrived. Ben stood in the kitchen, suitcase in hand, while Sarah and Emily hugged him tightly. Emily, who had always been a source of quiet strength, smiled up at him. "Good luck, Dad," she said. You're going to kill it." Sarah kissed him softly on the cheek, her eyes filled with pride. "We'll be here, waiting. No matter what happens, we're proud of you." With a final hug, Ben stepped out into the cool morning air, his heart heavy with both excitement and fear. As he drove to the airport, the small town of Cedar Hill faded into the distance, replaced by the hum of anticipation that came with flying into the unknown. When Ben arrived in Nashville, the city's energy hit him like a tidal wave. The streets were alive with music, the sounds of guitars, pianos, and drums spilling out of every bar and venue. It was a city built on dreams, a place where thousands had come to make a name for themselves, but where only a few would ever truly succeed. The day of the audition arrived faster than Ben had anticipated. He found himself standing outside Blue Sky Records, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was sleek and modern, a far cry from the small studio where he had recorded his demo. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, with producers and musicians milling about, each of them focused, determined, and driven. Daniel met him in the lobby, offering a reassuring pat on the back. "You've got this, Ben," he said. "Just play like you did at the festival. Let the music speak for itself." Ben nodded, but his palms were sweating, his heart racing. He was about to step into a room full of people who would judge every note he played, every word he sang. This wasn't Cedar Hill anymore. This was Nashville. This was the big leagues. When Ben stepped into the audition room, the producers sat behind a long table, their expressions serious but open. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Ben took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of his guitar as he stepped up to the microphone. And then, just like at the festival, the fear melted away. The music took over, and he began to play. His fingers moved fluidly over the strings, his voice strong and steady as he poured everything he had into the performance. The song, the same one that had captured the crowd at the festival, filled the room with its raw emotion, its heartache, and its hope. When the last note faded, the room was silent. Ben stood there, breathless, waiting for some kind of reaction. And then one of the producers leaned forward, a smile breaking across his face. "That was something special," he said. "Let's talk." Ben exhaled, the tension in his chest finally releasing. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a beginning, a real beginning. And for the first time in years, Ben allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this dream was finally within reach. The deal with Blue Sky Records was the first major milestone, but it was only the beginning of a journey that Ben could have never fully anticipated. The meeting had gone well, better than he could have hoped for. The producers were impressed by his authenticity, the raw emotion in his voice, and the soulfulness of his music. They wanted to take a chance on him, but even as they expressed their interest, they made it clear that the road ahead would be anything but easy. "You've got something rare, Ben," said Michael Harper, one of the senior producers at Blue Sky Records. He was a man in his late 50s, weathered and grizzled, someone who had seen countless musicians rise and fall. But the industry is brutal. It's not just about talent. It's about how much you're willing to endure. There will be long nights, tough decisions, and people who will doubt you at every turn. But if you're ready for that, we're ready to get behind you. The words weighed heavily on Ben. He had known this wasn't going to be a simple path, but hearing it laid out so plainly brought a new layer of reality to the situation. Yet, as he looked at the faces around the table, all of them waiting for his response, he realized that he was ready. Maybe he wasn't in his 20s anymore. Maybe he had taken a detour in life that many of these younger artists hadn't. But there was something to be said for experience, for the wisdom that came with age, and for the years of grit that had shaped him into the man he was now. "I'm in," Ben said, his voice steady. That one simple phrase set everything in motion. Within days, Ben was signing paperwork, reviewing contracts, and working with Blue Sky's team to figure out his next steps. The label wanted to start by releasing an EP, a collection of 5 or 6 songs that would introduce Ben's music to the world. It was a test, in a way. If the EP performed well, it could lead to a full album, tours, and even more opportunities down the line. But if it flopped, well, Ben didn't want to think about that possibility. The next few months were a blur of recording sessions, songwriting meetings, and late nights in the studio. Ben threw himself into the work, his passion for music reigniting with every strum of his guitar and every lyric he penned. The creative process was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. There were days when Ben would leave the studio at midnight, his fingers sore from playing and his voice hoarse from singing, only to do it all over again the next day. But through it all, he felt alive. This was what he had always dreamed of, the chance to create music that mattered, music that spoke to people's hearts. And for the first time in years, Ben wasn't just living a life of quiet routine. He was chasing something bigger, something that had always felt just out of reach. Back home, things were changing too. Sarah and Emily had been nothing but supportive, but Ben could tell that the strain of his new lifestyle was starting to show. He was away more often, traveling back and forth between Cedar Hill and Nashville, and the distance was beginning to take its toll. One evening, after another long day in the studio, Ben returned home to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, a look of quiet contemplation on her face. The house was still and quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. "We need to talk," she said softly as he entered the room. Ben felt his stomach drop. He knew what was coming. They had been skirting around this conversation for weeks now, but there was no avoiding it any longer. He sat down across from her, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. "I've been trying to be strong about this," Sarah began, her voice measured and calm. "But it's hard, Ben. You're gone a lot. And I get it. I know this is your dream. I know how important this is to you. But it's been tough on Emily. It's been tough on both of us." Ben's heart ached as he listened to her words. He had always known that this new chapter in his life would come with sacrifices, but he hadn't realized just how much it would affect his family. He had been so caught up in the whirlwind of his career that he hadn't stopped to think about how it was impacting the people he loved most. "I don't want you to stop," Sarah continued, her eyes softening. "I want you to follow this dream. I need to know that we're not being left behind. I need to know that we still matter." Ben reached across the table and took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "You and Emily will always come first," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry if I've made you feel otherwise. This has all been so overwhelming, and I've been trying to juggle everything. But I can't do this without you, Sarah. You and Emily are my anchor. You're the reason I'm doing any of this." Sarah smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just don't want to lose you, Ben." "You won't," he promised. "I'll figure out a way to make this work. I'll find balance. I swear." They sat there for a long while, holding hands in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Ben knew that he couldn't let his dream come at the expense of his family. He had to find a way to balance both worlds, to pursue his passion while still being the husband and father that Sarah and Emily needed. The months rolled on, and slowly Ben began to find that balance. He set boundaries, making sure to carve out time for his family, even as the demands of his music career grew. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the pressure felt overwhelming, when the expectations from the label seemed impossible to meet. But Ben had something that many younger artists didn't: perspective. He knew what mattered most in life, and it wasn't fame or fortune. It was the people who stood by you when the spotlight dimmed. As the release date for Ben's EP approached, the excitement in the air was palpable. Blue Sky Records had put together a small but effective marketing campaign, and they were confident that Ben's music would resonate with a wide audience. But as the day of the release neared, Ben couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. What if the world didn't like his music? What if this whole journey had been for nothing? The night before the EP dropped, Ben found himself alone in the living room, his guitar in his lap. He strummed a few soft chords, the sound filling the quiet space. The house was still, Sarah and Emily already asleep upstairs. In the dim light of the room, Ben reflected on everything that had led him to this moment. The sacrifices, the late nights, the doubts, and the dreams that had once seemed so far away. He thought back to that night at the fall festival, when he had first stepped onto the stage after years of hiding in the shadows. He had been terrified then, just as he was now. But that night, something had changed. He had found his voice again, and with it, a part of himself that he had thought was lost forever. Now, as the release of his EP loomed, Ben realized that this wasn't just about the music. It was about the journey, the ups and downs, the triumphs and the failures, the lessons learned along the way. It was about finding himself again, not just as a musician, but as a man. The next morning, the EP went live. Ben spent the day in a haze, checking his phone obsessively for updates, waiting for any sign of how the world was reacting to his music. The hours ticked by, and slowly, the feedback started to trickle in. Positive reviews from music blogs, comments on social media praising his heartfelt lyrics and soulful voice, messages from fans who had been moved by his songs. It wasn't a viral sensation. It wasn't an overnight success story, but it was real. People were listening. People were connecting with his music. And for Ben, that was enough. Over the next few months, the EP gained traction. It wasn't breaking any records, but it was steadily building a following. Small radio stations started playing his songs, and offers for local gigs and small tours began to roll in. Ben's career was starting to take shape, slowly but surely. And through it all, he kept his promise to Sarah and Emily, always making sure to keep them at the center of his life. One night, as Ben prepared to head out for a small show in a neighboring town, Sarah pulled him aside, a soft smile on her face. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Ben smiled back, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." As he stepped onto the stage that night, guitar in hand, Ben looked out at the small crowd gathered before him. They were there for him, to hear his music, to share in the journey he had been on. And as he began to play, a sense of peace washed over him. He had found his way back to the dream he had once lost. But more importantly, he had found his way back to himself.